Hey there YouTube, I'm Yukitsu, this is Yukitsu Times. Welcome to my channel, welcome to a little bit of Age of Wonders Planetfall. So today we're going to be talking about the Shakarn Celestians, and this is another setup that has some okay synergy, but we'll be talking a little bit about why I think this is probably going to be the last one that I bother doing a video of for this faction. So anyway, let's dive into some stuff here. So first of all, as always, we've got our Society tab for the Doctrines, and starting off, we've got the Dwelling Intimidation, as well as the Homeworld Reminiscence. And this is when you also get the Propagation Towers, which are quite nice. So the thing about this is that with the Celestians, you're always looking to get the 10% discount. And this is a sort of triply good sort of thing here, because you can get a little bit of influence from your starting colony, and that means that you're capable of using happiness gains to get a little bit more of that. So just randomly you might get a little bit more influence thanks to that. But more importantly, you get Dwelling Intimidation. Early in the game, you're going to be needing to use this to get your NPC factions into situations where you're happy with how they're being handled, and this is a way that you can sort of get that in the early game. You're probably going to want to eventually get rid of it. I forgot to in this particular playthrough, but it is a way to sort of get your start without paying as much of your influence out that you need to save. It does combine nicely with Karmic Amplification. It's going to be allowing you to get more quests more frequently, getting more of that influence. Like, of course, Celestine's obviously going to give you a few things that allow you to add to that sort of influence gain, because that's how they play. And then you've also got active agent networks. So this is actually really, really powerful. +2 influence per turn for each active infiltration on a unique player. And yeah, you can get a decent amount of extra stuff there. I don't have that right now because I killed all my enemies, but that's sort of how this game plays. It's a little bit clunky to get this bonus, but I find that this is one of the few ones that does have an okay chance of working out okay, and does give you a decent amount of extra influence. Next up, of course, Neo-Evangelicals, again, doesn't have the strongest sort of bonuses. I don't really believe there's anything super good here. Missionary Negotiators is similar in a lot of respects to the Dwelling Intimidation, but by the time you get up to here, you really shouldn't be buying any more stuff from the NPC factions, so this shouldn't be as much of an issue by that point in time. Heightened Domak Regimen, +10% damage, +10% accuracy, and upkeep reduced by 20%, obviously really, really powerful. And then Holocrafted Zardoz Channel, this is a lot less relevant in this particular setup, so you're probably not going to be worrying about this one, unless you're going for an infiltrator-based build, which you could theoretically do. So anyway, what's nice about the setup is that you do have all those extra little bits of influence gain as well as happiness gain, which are going to again feed into that sort of influence. You've also got a couple of nice bonuses here to the combat abilities of your sort of units there, but there's also plenty of ones that you're not going to want to use at all there. And the kind of okay thing about this is that the ones that are not really that good, things like, for example, the Scorched Earth policy, you're just going to avoid them. It's not really that tricky to say that those are sort of throw out. And since there's limited doctrine slots, it really doesn't matter that much that that's going to be the case there. All right, next up we've got our units. So the thing about the Celestian tree is that realistically speaking, the only thing that I find I'm happy with is going up to Penance for Shield of Remorse. Anything past that, I kind of just don't really actually find I'm getting much use out of it. So starting off, you get, of course, Tenets of Tranquility. This is more important for other factions, but if you're going to be playing Celestians and playing as the Shakarn, you don't have access to early stagger resistance, so you might find this is something that you want if you're getting staggered a lot in the early game. Later on, however, you're going to definitely want to swap that out for the Assault Exoskeleton. There's also the fact that you can get the holochromatic engines for stagger resistance if you want to go that route. So these guys have got options for that stagger resistance. They don't have to be going for those. The only thing is that they get them quite late. So you're probably going to consider getting that if you're getting staggered a lot. And it's worthwhile in that sort of case, especially since it's cheaper now in terms of cosmic cost to upgrade out of old upgrades. I really like Shield of Remorse. I think it's a powerful buff there. The chance to add Soul Burn to the enemy is really good, and adding Remorse to the enemy is a great way to cause them to fumble a bunch of attacks, especially because it does stack with itself. The +10 hit points is also a decent amount of extra hit points for a basic mod, so I think that's quite good. Going further than that, you get up to Perseverance with the Tentative Healing. I think that there is actually an application for that in this particular faction, because their starting support unit, the Infiltrator, doesn't have a healing effect. So that means that you're not getting a healer until you get to the Tactician or you get to the Star Guide. Now, for my part, I actually would go from Luminance to the Star Presence text before I would get Perseverance. And the reason for this is that I need to rush this tree to get up to the Axiom of Light, whereas there's nothing else that I'm getting from this bottom tech tree here. So you could, if you needed healers, use Star Guides, but the reality is I'm probably not going to bother building Star Guides with this faction. It's an okay sort of buff support unit, but it's not really that amazing. So you're probably waiting until you get something like Tacticians, but they're quite expensive, quite late game, quite a costly sort of unit there. So even here, it's not that amazing to sort of work on that. But if you are rushing the Axiom of Light tech, you can get pretty crazy amounts of influence with this faction, even relatively early on, and saving up for that 100 so that you can get a quick Ascended Teacher is not too hard, and it is, realistically speaking, like the best healer that you can really get in this game. So you can kind of get through that way, but if you need healing early game, this is kind of your only option with this faction, unless you're capable of copying an enemy support with an Infiltrator, which you definitely cannot guarantee that you're going to be able to do that. So the Star Guide as well as the Lightbringer, these are basic. There's nothing too special about either of them. They have got the basic traits for the Shakarn, which is the epimorphic regeneration, giving them a little bit of extra regeneration if they take a bit of damage, as well as that Xenodebilitation as a cost compared to that. So they will take more status effects, but they will heal a little bit of damage. So other than that, pretty much the standard for those sorts of units. Next up for tech, we have access to the Tenets of Pacifism. You don't have access to the Psionic Tree, so you're not capable of doing anything too spectacular with this thing here. And I find it a bit high risk, a bit low reward. It does disable the unit, sure, but it's only got an 8 strength chance of happening, and realistically speaking, for that kind of action economy, I would much rather try and just take over a unit or do literally anything else. There's a few instances where this could potentially be useful, but there are other more powerful buffs and debuffs that you could be applying. Like, I would often much rather be using the Hollow Reality Mantle to having a chance of afflicting hallucination to a larger number of units. And honestly, the Hollow Reality Mantle is just an all-around pretty good mod for that type of effect there in general. It's not as powerful in effect. Hallucination is not as good as Pacified, but it's still pretty good and affects multiple targets there. Lastly, of course, you get the Shield of Reckoning, and again, I don't necessarily think that this one's worth going all this way down the tech tree for, especially in this case, because you do want to at least get to cast advancements, and that means that you're probably going to get to Holochromatic Engines, and I would say that Holochromatic Engines is probably pretty comparable in terms of how it's used to the Shield of Reckoning. The Shield of Reckoning is guaranteed damage even if your unit dies. If your unit dies, then the Holochromatic Engines are, of course, not going to be able to do anything, and also this can only be applied to the heavy units, which means you can't apply it to any of the Celestian tech units, but, you know, you take damage, you're able to deal some damage, I guess, so it's pretty comparable, but also this has stagger resistance, so that's why I think this is a little bit superior to the Shield of Reckoning, because ideally speaking, you're not letting your units get killed anyway, especially if they've got tier 3 mods on them. That's just a horrible thing to have happen. So that's kind of all the mods there, and again, generally speaking, I'm going to stop at Penance, and then I'm going to start going for the Ascended Teachers, rather than trying to go through this whole tech tree and trying to get all the stuff that I've gotten in this particular playthrough, just so I could see if they were useful. Up here, we've got access to things like the portable scanners. Not necessarily something I think is too useful for this faction. I don't think that the secret tech benefits tremendously from it. But if I wanted to, I could throw that on something like the Ascended Teacher, who could scan a bunch of people with his area of effect attack there. And there's a couple ways to use the portable scanners, I just don't think that it's a tremendously necessary effect there. Next up, you've got access to the Impairing Grenade. I think that this is actually going to be pretty okay for this particular composition. You're going to be relying on a lot of early game units, and a way to make it so that those early game units are competitive to late game compositions is removing the mods from enemy late game units, and that is what Impairing does. That makes it so that those units are incapable of using their mods for a turn. Makes them much more vulnerable to follow-up attacks, meaning that if you lead with an Impairing Grenade, you can often finish those units off. It's a very powerful grenade attack. 14 damages for a grenade is pretty good, and the units that you're probably going to be building do get a lot of benefit out of the Impairing Grenade. Xeno Defense Module, there are certain situations where this is going to be highly useful, and there's plenty of situations where it's not. Figure out if you're going to be up against one damage type a lot, and if you are, then the Xeno Defense Module is going to be really powerful. If you're not going to be up against one damage type, you're going to be up against someone that's got, like, say, 2 or 3 or 4 different damage types in their compositions, then this is going to be next to useless. The Hollow Displacement Shields, this one's actually quite good on things like the Lightbringers. You can add this to them, making them harder to hit as they advance towards the enemy, making it so that they're capable of getting there a little bit more safely. I do think that Skitter is actually a very, very powerful sort of ability. So the Hollow Displacement Shields are actually pretty okay. It's just that there's often a lot of your units are not ones with single attacks. They often have repeating attacks. So it's not the best, but it's not terrible either. Take this when you're up against units where you just need to be able to close towards the enemy without taking too much damage, and you've got a lot of melee type units or short range units, and you're worried about just taking too much firepower as you advance. Next up, of course, is the Orbital Recall Systems, which is basically it still looks like some kind of donger machine for I don't even want to know what. But again, you're heavily reliant on repeating attacks with this composition here. The Lightbringer, the Star Guide, and your Ascended Teachers all use repeating attacks. There are a few support type abilities for them that do only require a single action, so the Tactical Redeploy could be used after they move, then Tactical Redeploy, and then use those abilities, like the Mind Control from the Ascended Teachers, the Blind from the Star Guide, stuff like that. Those are kind of okay uses for this, but I definitely wouldn't want to use up a use slot for that sort of purpose there. Here's where we get to the real heavy hitters, the Assault Exoskeleton. Plus 25% critical chance, plus 20% accuracy, and 1 level of stagger resistance, as well as plus 2 armor. Even though you're missing out on the plus 20% accuracy for your Lightbringers, this is still a fantastic mod. Plus 25% critical chance, plus 1 level of stagger resistance, plus 2 armor. This is going to help them in a lot of situations, and it is probably the single most powerful anti-stagger mod for a melee type unit in the game. And the only real problem with this is that, like, you're missing out on that plus 20% accuracy, so it's quite expensive for what it's doing, but it's still probably worth it in most situations. If you've got ranged units as well that are going to be a little bit vulnerable, which yours often are because they're 5 range instead of 7, the Assault Exoskeleton is absolutely amazing. Next up is the Hollow Reality Mantle. Like I said, Hallucination's not the worst effect that you can apply in this game, but it's still really easy to apply it to a lot of units when you've got a bunch of guys running around Hollow Reality Mantles, but I would still primarily put this on your support type units, especially because Hollow Real Cover can be used in conjunction with your Ascended Teachers in a really interesting way. So if you use Hollow Real Cover, you can maintain one of your points or one of your action points. So you run your Ascended Teacher up to your opponent there, use Hollow Real Cover, and if you fail to hallucinate a unit, you can more easily mind control them because they'll have Broken Mind applied to them. So this is a really powerful module. I think that this is one of the better ones out there, and I do think that this one can have some pretty interesting applications. Lastly, of course, you've got the trigger phase systems. This is extra useless for the Celestians. The reason that this is so useless for them is that you're paying a lot for resurgence when you're using this mod, but Ascended Teachers give everyone in the stack resurgence for free. So if you make sure that all of your stacks have an Ascended Teacher, then you're going to have resurgence across the board anyhow. And what resurgence does is it means that if your unit is killed during the battle, they come back at the end of the battle. So you won't have them to fight with you after they get killed in that fight, but you will as soon as you get into the next fight. This is a really, really powerful ability. It means that your armies are not going to be suffering attrition so long as your Ascended Teachers never die and so long as you never lose a battle, which you probably won't be doing as Celestians in the late game as you're rolling over the enemy. Now, the plus 30% damage and plus 3 resistance to damage is powerful, but losing control of these units really does suck, so I don't think that Omni Activation is a great ability. Holochromatic engines, I'm assuming that this is quite good. I just haven't figured out how to properly use these things to be cost effective in very many situations. Just ideally, you don't want people to be taking a lot of hits where they would be able to get the most use out of this thing. It's kind of a weird mod. I'm not too sure about it. I feel as though the effects of this, though, have a lot of potential. I just need to figure out a great way to use it. It is an expensive mod, however, so I can sort of also understand maybe skipping it. It's not really a necessary one. Anyhow, let's take a look at the units here. Starting off with the basics. So for these particular guys, Shakarn Raider here. The Shakarn Raider is going to probably not benefit a ton from the mods that you're going to be getting out of these guys. Same with the Infiltrator, of course, because the Infiltrator can't use anything. But for the Raider, the only thing that you're probably going to be doing is the Shield of Remorse. You could theoretically try to slap something like the Healing Pulse on them, but if you give everyone a Healing Pulse, everyone takes like 20 damage from the... Like, if you've got 6 guys and the enemy is capable of doing like, say, 25 damage per enemy unit, which is not unreasonable, you'll heal like your 20 damage. Your opponent will then just deal 25 damage, which means you're at a net loss of 5 if you use the Tendons of Healing. This is supposed to be more selective rather than something you spam. The Purifier thing from the Prometheans is much stronger because it's a free action sort of thing. You also don't really care too much about something like the Tents of Tranquility. Your Raiders are not something that really requires stagger resistance, so you're probably not going to go for that early. More important a little bit later when you get the Assault Exoskeleton, just because there's going to be more stuff out there that can stagger you, but even then, you're taking this for the other effects, not for the stagger resistance for that particular unit. You could theoretically spam out Tenets of Pacifism, but that's expensive and not necessarily effective, so again, I don't really like that idea. The Shield of Reckoning, I mean, you could have this just on a whole bunch of Raiders as they sort of run forward there, especially if you've modeled them so that they're heavily damage resistant, since they're capable of regenerating their own health over time as they take damage. The Shield of Reckoning could potentially be used to make it so that all of them are just healing through all the damage and your opponent is killing themselves as they bash the face into you. I still wouldn't say that that's my favorite sort of strategy there. After all, he is, by definition, causing twice as much damage to you as you are to him, so not really my favorite there. The Raider, I think, is going to benefit primarily from his own mods, from Shakarn mods, and I think that that's going to be a trend for a lot of the instances where you're playing the Shakarn. Now, they're weird friggin' shooter units that the Deadeye here. Still haven't really figured out a great role for these guys. Yeah, Deadly Overwatch is pretty nice with that Omni Cannon, but even with that, these guys are not my favorite unit, with all honesty, but if I had to say that there's going to be anything for these guys, again, it would be the Shield of Reckoning, but they don't need it quite as much as the others because they're a bit longer range. They're not going to be in the fight, since there will be plenty of stuff in front of them with this composition, whether it's Lightbringers or whether it's Raiders, or even if you've got a bunch of the Infiltrators, they'll probably be up in front of your Deadeyes. So they don't need to have the Shield of Reckoning as much as you would expect them to. And what's worse is that you're pretty much never going to need it, because even if these guys are getting staggered a couple times or something, like the enemy doesn't prioritize these like snipers. Snipers get prioritized because if you get one level of stagger off against them, then they can't fire, whereas with these guys you have to stagger them 3 times before they're not capable of firing, which is just not going to happen. So the Shield of Reckoning is not necessary for these guys because you're not going to get focused with them. They're going to be further back. They're going to be just fine doing their own thing there. Not really sure what the hell these units are honestly for, though, so I don't think about them too much in general. And your scouts, there's nothing really as far as your recon goes that you're going to be throwing on here from the side of the Celestians, because you're not allowed to put anything on it. So, you know, sort of typical stuff there. Drone sort of units tend not to get along with Celestians. Just the way it is. And, you know, nothing wrong with that either. And, of course, that over there. So, in any event there, let's talk about their other units. So, first of all, we've got the Propagator. Now, this is a pretty decent unit, and you could theoretically throw on a couple of the mods, I believe, from Celestine. But for the most part, it's going to be Shield of Reckoning yet again. This is one of those sorts of units where you could go sort of full tank mode, where you'd go something like Shields of Shield of Remorse, sorry. Shield of Remorse is what you should be giving these guys. You could go Shield of Reckoning on this sort of thing here, and you could go sort of full support with like maybe the Tenets of Pacifism and the Hollow Reality Mantle. But this is actually a really strong basher type ship there. I think that this thing does much, much better if you're giving it a bunch of the damage type mods for its sonic weapons, and you're giving it the Shakarn type upgrades there. You could also give it the hollow displacement shields to make it so it could zip around and use the Dissonos ability whenever it gets a chance to. But this thing, like, just have it stand there firing, it's going to deal the most damage in that sort of way. So not really something that fits in too well with the Celestine model. I went and looked at the next one. You've got, again, this weirdo. This again is competing with something else, much cheaper, much more cost-efficient melee with the Lightbringer. And I think that the Lightbringer is actually a little bit more usable than the Firebrand. The Firebrand is nice because it can attack an air unit, so that in and of itself makes it quite a bit better. It's just really quite expensive for a melee type unit. I'm very confused by these things. Their damage is also very, very high though, so if you did just need something that was an upgrade from the Firebringer or Lightbringer, this thing does offer that. It does have the ability to sort of get in there and start tearing the enemy apart really, really hard. But it's kind of hard to justify taking these guys when you do have access to those Lightbringers. I'd rather have a stack of like 6 Lightbringers rather than 3 of these guys in general. And most of the time I'm not going to be able to have like a stack of 6 Firebrands. That would just be that would be pretty expensive. So next up is the Tactician. I've been told that these guys are actually really, really good. For me, I think I'm spoiled by the Heritor, where it feels like these abilities are Heritor abilities, except much later and on a much more expensive unit. So to me, it still feels a little bit like a weak unit. Of course, it is pretty much a support type unit. It's One of Us All Along, and Sonoblast being its sort of more offensive capabilities. And even then, One of Us All Along is actually a pretty much support type unit ability there, I guess. Still, it's got a lot to it. It's just very, very expensive for what it does, in my opinion. And it's pretty late game for a support. It is nice that it is a very durable and powerful support though, so it does have those edges for it. It's just that I don't want to pay a bunch of money on like hit points, armor, and damage on a support unit. Support units I want to be relatively cost efficient so I can have those support abilities in each of my stacks for relatively cheap. So I still don't personally like these guys, but I can definitely see that there's some potential to them. If I really like these abilities though, I'm going to play Heritor. Especially with this faction where their default stuff is just not very good. Next up is the Refractor. This thing does not necessarily benefit too much from the stuff that you're looking at from the Celestians, so we're not going to think about that too much. And Gamma Supremacy for the Shakarn. Again, this thing's a little bit too expensive for what it does here. The Omni Beam is still just not a ton of damage, all things considered, unless you can really get a lot of enemies. What you're paying for this thing to deal a 26 damage shot to maybe 3 guys or something like that, that's not amazing considering that's 700 energy and 40 Cosmite. Even if you get a pretty good shot with the Omni Beam, like hitting 4 guys, I would actually still rather take the Vanguard Super Unit, and the Vanguard Super Unit's kind of trash. So I don't really know what this thing's about, personally speaking. It's a weird unit. And again, does not gain a ton of synergy from the stuff that you're seeing from the Celestians, so there is also that. So that is a look at all the units there. Take a look at some of my models here. The Ascended Teacher in this case, we've got the Assault Exoskeleton. This gives him a really decent critical chance, good accuracy, and that level of stagger resistance, as well as 2 points of armor. Makes the Ascended Teacher quite durable, quite tanky. Add to that the Shield of Remorse, makes it even more durable, as well as making it so that your opponent can't consistently focus fire this guy as easily across multiple turns, making it more likely he'll probably survive an engagement there. Then you've got the Hollow Reality Mantle, messes with anyone that does decide to shoot at him, as well as being able to throw that Hollow Real cover over a cluster of enemies to mind break them, and then you could potentially use that Compelling Presence on them right afterwards, or you could use that as a sort of way to then use Celestial Wrath on them. It's pretty much possible since they'll be mind broken. It's just much more likely to deal soul burn to them. And again, like, the damage on Celestial Wrath is deceptive. You've actually got much more because you're going to have more enlightened units in the battle with these guys. Going to end up having plus 25 damage to that. So for a total of 36 base damage. and then I've got no offensive mods, but who cares? 36 damage is really, really good. So next up, we've got our Celestian Star Guides here. I haven't bothered upgrading them. I'm not bothering taking them in this particular case. I think that I just go for the offensive with these guys, and that sort of tends to work out rather than worrying too much about support. And what support I do need can be thrown out by the Ascended Teacher if I need that healing. Celestial Radiance is really, really powerful. Next up, we've got access to the Scout here. We're not upgrading that just because it doesn't really need to be upgraded here. We're not using ours for combat in this case. The Raider, we've gone and given ours the Shield of Remorse as well as the Impairing Grenade and the Assault Exoskeleton. This is a really, really powerful sort of combination there. Two of these mods are fairly early game, fairly easy to get on them, and you can stick with these for quite a while. You don't actually need to throw the Impairing Grenade on for a decent amount of time if you really wanted to get something in that slot other than the Impairing Grenade, because again, you're not going to need it until late game. You can swap that out in the early game for something like the Focused Sonolysis module, which does allow you to get that armor melt, which is always a pretty useful thing to have added to people in any stage of the game there. You could also try to go for something else, but the Sonic weapons actually surprisingly have kind of janky, weird upgrades. They're not bad, but they're not my favorite. Other than that, I probably would not really bother with too many other modules. Like, it could potentially even be viable for the early game, just giving the Shield of Remorse and nothing else for quite a while, and then upgrading them again later. If you're going to do that, though, you might as well throw the Impairing Grenade on them, because it does give them that extra action. Gives them an extra little bit of armor as well, so capable of doing a little bit more there. And then the Assault Exoskeleton, of course, in the late game is really, really powerful. Now, this is a sort of a spam unit. It's pretty cheap to manufacture these, even with all this other stuff added to it, so you're going to be able to do a lot of damage using these guys. I highly recommend them. For the Infiltrator, obviously no modules. They can't have modules. The Shakarn Deadeye, I don't really bother manufacturing a lot of them, so I never bothered upgrading them. And this particular playthrough, I just spammed Raiders. Now, one of the reasons why you're seeing me spam Raiders instead of going for a diversity of units is because of the base stats of these guys. These guys have got the highest sort of base damage in the game, so long as you're able to get into that closer range. And even when they're at longer range, they're equal to longer ranged units at that sort of distance. The only exception is if you're 6 or 7 tiles away, where of course these guys can't fire at all, where they're substantially worse for obvious reasons. But when you sort of factor in like how quickly units tend to end up gummed up together in this game, these guys are still one of the most highly performing basic tier units in the game, and basic tier units were already ridiculously powerful in this game. So that sort of combination of them having those two traits. Also, like, Omni Rush has been pretty consistently powerful. Like, Concussion doesn't come across all that often, but being able to sort of get that rarely on those rare occasions where it does work is tremendously more powerful than what you get from a grenade or from that stagger shot that the Syndicate has, and even more powerful in some ways than the blinding grenade that the Amazons use. It's a very, very powerful effect. It just happens very rarely. So this unit is just really highly performing for what it does. It does have a few minor weaknesses, but I would still say that's probably the strongest basic troop in the game right now. And that's not even being hyperbolic. It just is really, really good. So you're going to see a lot of Shakarn, I think, just being a spam of Raiders, which is a bit unfortunate. Now, if I was going to take another unit, it would probably be the Propagator. The reason for this is that they've got high stagger on the basic attack there, which is quite rare for a lot of units. This is a very, very powerful air unit in my opinion, and one of the factions that I think does a little bit better with that sort of style, because you also get access to the Hollow Mend effect on these guys, meaning you can use these guys as a bit of a support thing. So if you've got a spam of them, they could also self-sustain themselves a little bit better than you possibly could using another sort of style of unit there. One of the problems with these guys, though, is that this unit does run into the problem of not having that healing effect, that standard healing that their organic units have. So it does run into a little bit of sustain problem as far as that goes. This guy also has access to like the propagation effects here, so propagation motivation, so could definitely see this as being more of just a... I don't know, I think that I would still use this as an offensive unit, even though they have got access to Hollow Mend. It's not a huge heal, so I mean it would just be more of an emergency type thing. Alright, next up you've got access to the Lightbringers. Excuse me. So for these guys you've got access to, you know, pretty much the normal stuff. They also can disorient on their dash, which hasn't seemingly come into play tremendously. The thing about these guys is that they're pretty standard. I don't think that they're actually that necessarily good in this composition, because unlike with many other versions of the Lightbringer, they're not actually much harder hitting, or even harder hitting at all than your basic trooper. Just because the Shakarn Raider is so ridiculously powerful at close range, you could actually just be adjacent to someone blasting away with a Raider and ending up doing pretty comparable damage, if not, you know, more damage than the Lightbringer. I think it's actually slightly less damage actually on the Raider than the Lightbringer. I think it's slightly less. But basically this unit sort of ends up in a more redundant place than you would normally expect to see it, of that high damage close range sort of fire. But yeah, that's all the units there. Let's take a look at the armies that I've got loitering around the map if I can find the damn things. Got one over here, so this one is just a stack of Raiders along with a random Psycho. We got... trying to remember where I've put my armies here. Here they are. So here we've just got a Ascended Teacher along with a bunch of Raiders. Got a Hero, a Bee, and some Raiders. Unfortunately we don't have the Ascended Teacher yet. Over here we have the Ascended Teacher, a Specialist, Artisan, whatever, that we got from a quest, so that's that one, a Bee, an Infiltrator, and a Liquid Magma. So mostly just sort of random stuff added to whatever. This gigantic stack here is my ally. I've been finding that the game in the recent patches made it much easier for me to get allies, so I think that that's just been a really nice feature, or whatever you want to think of that as. I'm not too sure, but it's helped a lot regardless of how you think about it. And I know I had some more armies somewhere out here, but I do not. Here they are. Over here we got the Ascended Teacher, we got our Lightbringer, and then we've got some more Raiders. And then over here we've got an Ascended Teacher, Hopperhound Blade Maw, Liquid Magma, and some more Raiders as well as a Hero. So that's kind of how our stacks go. It's just, it's as long as you've got an Ascended Teacher in your stack, you really don't care what else is in there. The Ascended Teacher just adds so much value to whatever it is you're already using that you can just sort of stomp over whatever it is you're getting, and this faction is particularly quite good at getting Ascended Teachers. Along with something like the Syndicate, I think the Syndicate are also quite good at playing that sort of style. But in any event, that's our video for today. Hope you found this one enjoyable, and of course, as always, hope to see you guys all next time.